The Corvette has a long and storied history, filled with both its triumphs and failures. It has been a working-class hero for millions. In the age of spec sheet racing and internet clickbait, the 2020, the C8, is now a mid-engine reboot of an iconic sports car. Is the Vette a supercar or just another knockoff?
Making a C8 Corvette video is complicated. This would not be possible without the help of Autobahn Country Club in Joliet, Illinois, Xperience in Chicago, and Omaze.com. If you're even remotely interested in owning a 2020 Chevrolet C8 Corvette with a Z51 package, it might be hard to do, but you might have a better chance at potentially winning one by going to Omaze.com/Savagegees. Part of your donation will help to fund UCLA Medical Center's Emergency Services Department, which helped to save the life of the founder of Omaze and the editor-in-chief of Donut Media. Now head over to Omaze.com/Savagegees again to potentially win the Z51 package C8 Chevrolet Corvette. Enjoy the video.
The 2020 C8 Corvette. Now, if you're coming from a C7 like me, you're gonna be blown away by this cabin. Hell, if you're coming from any car, you're gonna be blown away by this cabin. It is extremely impressive. GM has in many ways reached their mountaintop. This is the nicest interior they've done in the last 30 years. Now, let's talk about the engineering before we get into the ergonomics and electronics. So what GM has accomplished with the C8 is they've increased the size of the passenger cell when compared to the C7. What that directly translates to the end user is you now have an extra inch of legroom and 9 degrees extra recline angle. So they've, no pun intended, widened the buying demographic of who can afford this vehicle. When talking about the interior electronics of the C8, it's worth once again mentioning that they've effectively lowered the entire beltline of this vehicle, dramatically increasing outward or frontward visibility. However, due to the giant V8 sitting back there, you don't have a lot of rearward visibility. So what they've done to remedy that in the 2LT and higher trim levels is they've added a digital backup camera. The digital display/dash in front of you is still configurable based upon the drive mode you're in, and you still have a heads-up display. Both have been updated as you're expecting to have higher resolution, and they are faster reacting. The seats as well, when talking about interior comfort, are a huge step up from what you found in the C7. These are the GT2 seats, so the equivalent of the touring seats found in the prior generation car, and they are a dramatic improvement. They're still heated and cooled, but they hold you in way better. They don't have a weird lumpiness to them, and they don't break down after long drives. So with that, let's head to the shop and talk turkey about the technical side of this vehicle.
Underneath the C8 Corvette, and from someone who is not a Corvette person, and I know many people aren't, this is such a massive difference. This is a completely new car. So Jack, coming from a C7, looking at the C8, tell me about what they tried to do here. What was the mission to make this?
So the design objectives of this car were entirely different than they were in the C7. The C7 was really an architecture that started in like 1997 with the C5. It was a double wishbone car front and rear, but it had transverse leaf springs front and back. And what they attempted to do with that car is turn a street car from basically their racing program. They nerfed a race car and turned it into a street car. This had a much different design objective. This was supposed to be a private jet for the road. So they made a very capable street car that can also do track work.
Okay. So this is supposed to be more refined, more complete. They've also gone from front engine to mid engine, and the body structure
is entirely different.
Entirely different. How did they take and make all of this?
Lots and lots of money.
And this would not exist without GM money. And this would not exist if they weren't planning to utilize what's made this car up.
The C8 architecture is safe to say this thing's going to be around for 1,000,000 years, which is a good thing presently in 2020. So before I talk about the suspension market, let's talk about the chassis architecture. The chassis in this car is basically all aluminum. It is an aluminum monocoque that looks a lot like you'd see in like a 458. You essentially have your passenger compartment, which is 25 to 30% stiffer than what was in the C7. Then you have a separate structure where the LT2 motor sits.
Yeah, so the engine cradle is also all aluminum, a separate structure, and using different technology for the stampings and everything that goes into that for rigidity.
This is the largest amount of die-cast aluminum components GM has ever used. There are 20 separate die castings, and instead of basically being riveted together with MIG welding, that's how the C7s were put together, they used adhesive on this car. Okay. There's something like 80 meters of adhesive used in this vehicle.
So they're bonding together aluminum, and this is something that had been this was used a long time ago, and now it's becoming more mainstream. So it's lighter, less materials, and when you look at the front end of this car, now suspension, like you talked about, in-wheel double wishbone, you have coil springs now, and just the knuckle design, the control arm design, compared to some of these bigger cars that we're looking at, this looks like it would come off of a Honda Civic. And I'm not kidding, it's so small and compact. They were clearly designing this to save weight while still maintaining the structural integrity of all the suspension parts.
They use a mix of cast and forged parts for the front suspension, but what they got out of going to a coilover suspension versus a transverse leaf spring was more adjustability. You can basically infinitely adjust the front end being a coilover system, and it's a true one. So if you get the Z51 package, with or without mag ride, the height adjustment, I mean, these cars come adjustable from the factory, which means you can corner balance a car from day one.
So you have camber, caster, toe, and ride height adjustability. So this is not supposed to be a track car yet, but all the fundamental pieces are to build on over the course of probably, like you said, a 20-year life cycle, or whatever SUV they turn this into.
The sky's the limit with this thing.
Yes, and and that's the thing.
The Chevy Equinox C8.
Well, that's the whole point. They're not gonna, from a business perspective, they're not gonna spend probably $1 billion on this.
I've heard rumors that this is the single most expensive architecture GM has ever built in the history of their entire company.
So you're going to see a Corvette Chevy Trax is the point. The bean counters are going to want to reuse this no matter how they can, and they built the flexibility in it to repurpose certain things. The next big change from the C7 is the steering rack, Jack.
So it is now column mounted, the EPS unit. It is shorter. The steering linkage is much shorter than what you found in the C7 because, again, being mid-engined, the packaging constraints are easier to work with, and it's 50% stiffer.
Okay. Next is aero. As you can take a look at the underbody,
there's not a whole lot to see.
There's nothing to see, but this is taking it, of course, if you're building a sports car, a supercar, you want this covered. So even the front control arms have a panel over them to help divert airflow from the front. And you can see these little pieces here. This is the lowest point of the car, and they're already torn up. And anything that is lower than these panels is going to drag on the ground with how low this car is. Now, there is an optional front-end lift.
Yes, and it is very impressive, and as I'm sure GM Marketing has already told the boys and girls watching this, it'll remember something like 1,000 locations. So when you plug in, this is where I'm lifting my car, it'll let you save that, so it'll automatically lift when you get there. It's a fairly inexpensive option, which is very impressive.
How much is it?
It's like $1,500.
The rest of the underbody here, we have airflow to the brakes. There's no dust shield on the brakes, and even the brake rotors and brake calipers don't look as massive as you would think. And again, this is all about managing heat, weight. Where do you need to pull weight out of, and where do you need to add it back? So when we look at the center support, tell me a little bit about this.
So much like the C7, the central structure of the chassis comes from this giant beam in the center. So unlike what you'd find in like a Ferrari, where the aluminum monocoque, you have giant side sills. Mm-hmm. because all the strength comes from the center of this car, the sills in this car could be lower for easier ingress and egress.
And that's really important because you look at cars like McLaren who use a carbon monocoque, Ferrari uses aluminum, and you talked about that. The way it is technically stronger to move those sills up because you're creating this 360 support. So GM knew that the customer base that's getting in and out of this car does not want to be tripping over a huge sill. It's a major selling detractor from supercars. So it's interesting that they looked at that and they knew their customer. Normally when we get to the back, I want to get in and out. Not with the C8, Jack. There is enough here to spend an hour talking about. I'm not even kidding. So let's start with the suspension. They made some major changes here. Coilover design, no more leaf springs. They've also changed the way you do the alignment adjustability. So they got rid of eccentric bolts, and now they have
a threaded design. They listened to the owners of the C7, and if you track your C7 like I do, that is a particularly large failure point. The other thing to bring up with suspension design, when you have a rear engine setup, your weight's in the back, as we're about to find out. It's about a 40-60 split, and normally when your motor's mid-engined or in the back of the car, you have a pretty big oversteer characteristic. And the typical, let's call it C8 owner, is a little bit older. This might be their first sports car. So they tried to inherently neutralize the oversteer characteristic by adding a little bit of understeer, which we'll talk about when we get into the track segment. But it is a very neutral feeling car, and the car moves around you. Because the center of gravity is where you're sitting, you're not basically in the back of the horse or in the in the front. You're in the middle of the object.
And this was by design, at least in this first generation car. They wanted it to be very accessible to the owners that were going to get behind the wheel of this. Confidence, comfortable, and the technology kind of takes a back seat. Now we're talking about it, but most of the owners aren't going to notice all of this, all the stuff that went into it. Now in the back suspension, to cover that, you notice one thing right away. It's way bigger in the back. Your knuckles, your upper control arms, and that's because you have so much weight over the rear. Well, typically you see all of that in the front. So these are just little things. Same thing with the belly pan underneath. We have this huge aluminum skid plate, the back diffuser, and you'll notice that you can get right to the oil filter here. This is a big thing about this car. Oil filter and drain plug. There's only one drain plug. Unlike the McLarens and Ferraris where you gotta pull 3 bolts out and drain the sump, you only have to pull out one drain plug. Now the only thing is, like this owner does his own oil changes, it can get a little bit messy, get caught in this undershield, and then you spray oil out the back of it. So this is just one of those things.
But it's still serviceable.
Right.
Their whole purpose of this car is they still wanted to make it moderately accessible to the key demographic of Corvette buyers and then potentially introduce new ones. As I mentioned in the front, Mark, this is a Z51 equipped car. So this means it has the E-Diff, similar to what you'd find in the C7, which has PTM, which is Corvette's performance traction management. And the way that works, it's a clutch-based diff. So based upon the steering mode you're in, the drive mode you're in, the steering angle, the throttle position,
the wipers are on,
the heat in the tires, legitimately.
Right, yeah.
It's taking all of these different computations and opening and closing the diff in the rear to maximize traction. This is not a Hellcat. The way this car is tuned is not to slide around and do big drifts. Sad day for me. It's about putting power down, maximizing lap times, and trying to get that 0 to 60 time below 3 seconds. That's what they've accomplished, largely due to the gear ratios in the back. And we'll talk about that when we get underneath the hood, I guess, in the trunk.
In the trunk, correct. This does have a dual clutch. This is a first for GM. This is also GM's first mid-engine car since the Fiero, which I'll get into before we get into the drive. So talk me through the dual clutch, sorry.
So Mark, yes, Tremec and GM basically re-engineered a PDK. They found that the Porsche-style dual clutch could not hold the torque that they were expecting out of their future LT motors.
So they had Tremec design this or alter it from an existing dual clutch that was on the market in the GT500. So how's it different from the GT500? It's on the same transmission architecture, but they made some adjustments.
It has an 8-speed versus a 7. So the way this car is geared in the Z51 package is first gear is really, really short, so you can get off the line very quickly. 2nd through 6th are your track gears, and 6 through 8 are your overdrives.
Now before we talk about that, Jack, we just got this off the bend pack lift, and I was a little bit surprised at how easy this was to put on the lift, aside from the ride height, which is, this car is so low, it's nuts. we're gonna put the weight chart and the balance chart up. This is the heaviest variant currently available now.
Yeah. This is the 3LT, which is the top of the line with the Z51 package. It has all the bits and bobs that add weight, but in the base model car is only supposed to be between 80 to 90 pounds heavier than the C7.
Okay, so we have this, SMC's sheet molding composites, which is mostly fiberglass and a proprietary resin that they use and polyurethane to attach to the panels. Now they use this to reduce weight. They also have a floating SMC in the back.
And it's floating because the SMCs they've developed have a density that allows them to float in water. To be honest, we're trying to not to go too Dungeons and Dragons on you, but we're going to see this car for a long, long time.
And we're going to talk about this more in depth when we get more of these vehicles. So let's get to the engine. What's the highlights of this, Jack?
So this is the LT2, which is based on the LT1. So what's unique about the LT is the top end of this has been revised from the LT1. The bottom end is still largely the same. It still has the same compression ratio, has the same forged components, has the same bore and stroke. But because it's now mid-engined, they didn't have to worry about the packaging constraints from the LT1. So the intake manifold's a great example of that. Again, in the C7 with the LT1, they had to compact the intake manifold. The runners can be longer, it can be taller, they don't have any of those constraints. That helps add horsepower. The exhaust technology in this as well, it's a 4-into-1 style equal length runners, which is something you'd see on a hyper exotic car. It helps with exhaust scavenging. Your oil system in this car, and that's really what's been dramatically improved from the LT1, now has 3 scavenging pumps versus 1, and the dry sump is not remote. So if you look at an LT1 on a C7, it has a remote reservoir that has to then be, the oil has to be fed into the motor. This is directly attached to the LT2.
Which is one of the reasons why you have one drain plug in the oil pan.
Yep, and their design goal was to be able to hold more than 1 G, not lose any oil pressure in 360 degrees of movement versus just front and back. Any direction. In theory, you could drive this car upside down.
Okay.
When it comes to the oiling system as well, because there are 3 pumps, it's far more effective. And the heads of this motor, the valve train, does not have any of the blowback from before. So the head has its separate oiling system from the rest of the engine. When they developed this motor, they only had a single engine failure versus the C7, where the LT1s were blowing up left and right when they were developing it.
Okay, so what about cooling? How do they handle that? That's got to be more difficult here.
Yeah, their oil cooler is much larger than it used to be, and it is 25% more thermally effective. I don't know how they're going to handle the forced induction variants of this car, but as of now, it has the same efficiency on track as the prior generation, or it's to that same level. You can run your full race sessions and theoretically not run into oil temp issues.
Okay, that's a positive sign. And before we get this out on the road, I'm only going to say one thing, and I made a joke about it earlier. The last mid-engine car was a Fiero. And I think as great as this is a supercar. It really is. You crash it, you damage it, it's going to cost you a fortune to fix. And the other part is reliability. We can get enamored with the low price tag. GM doesn't have the greatest history for having the most reliable things for
it doesn't matter in what it is. Equinoxes, trucks, the original C7s were a disaster. So if you want to be an early adopter, get the longest warranty you can possibly afford.
Yeah, agreed. Let's get this out on the road or on the track and see how it does compared to the C7, Jack.
All right, looking forward to it.
C8 street drive, Jack. Is this the miracle car?
We're about to find out, Mark. It's brisk.
It's quick. I wouldn't say this is like the fastest thing like I've been reading, but it is nothing like a Corvette. I'll tell you that. It doesn't remind me of any Corvette I've ever been in.
This to me, and I don't mean this in a negative way, is like a discount McLaren 570.
Okay.
It rides extraordinarily well.
It does. This is the best riding Corvette ever. Not only in the firmest modes, but in the comfort or street setting. You'll be blown away by the ride quality.
Yeah, and this is really where this car excels. As we talked about in the shop, they engineered this thing to basically be a private jet on the road. So you're It's low interior volume, it rides well, there's no weird vibration and harshness. This is a GT car first, and that's where this thing really excels. And it's not scary anymore.
No, it's not scary at all. I mean, it's just got the right amount of noise. Well, granted, he has this amazing exhaust system that was custom fabricated, so it's unfair to judge the sound completely. But in terms of the gearbox, this is the biggest discussion, getting rid of a manual for an automatic. So let's talk about that on the street.
So the reason they couldn't fit the manual in the car largely is due to packaging and the fact that we didn't make a strong enough business case to General Motors. Only 13% of total C7 sales were manual, and they just said, basically, screw it. No one's gonna buy it anyway. So what they've done here is they've taken the lineage of what you find in the GT500 DCT from Tremec and put in this car. As a regular automatic, it's excellent, kind of what you're expecting.
It feels almost identical to the GT500
yeah,
gearbox.
It does. Basically, with one fewer gears, it's very quick to react. It's almost basically no difference to a PDK in the way it feels, and that's as high of praise as you could possibly get.
And the shift speed and everything, it's not insanely fast, but it's super smooth. It's so smooth for the street. There's minimal gear shock, and it just responds so quickly to your inputs.
My only, I don't want to say it's a complaint, but it's something to bring up again. What we forgot to mention in the shop is this is brake-by-wire.
Which you don't really notice on the street, do you?
No, you don't. And when we take this to the track here in a couple minutes, I think that's where you're going to see some of the problems with a brake-by-wire system. But as a street car, something you're going to drive every day, yes, there's some understeer in street alignment, but again, for the demographic who's buying this car.
I feel like in a lot of ways, just being in here and looking at the interior and now experiencing it on the street, this reminds me, it's closer to like a Mercedes GT car, like a Mercedes Coupe, the AMG cars. That's kind of the character with a little bit more refinement. And I'd agree with you 100%. This feels more luxury GT than a true sports car, even though if you close your eyes and ignore the cockpit, that's what it feels like.
Yeah, and unfortunately, or fortunately for most people, you'll never be able to reach the limits of this car and find its true handling characteristic on the street. So I think now, Mark, that's as good as time as you could ever ask for to head to Autobahn.
All right, Jack, just got done with the C7 on track. This is so much different feeling in the C8 compared.
It is a entirely different driving experience. Obviously, the dynamics of this car are much different, being mid-engine versus front, but from a engagement standpoint, you and I have said this a lot off camera. On track, to me, this feels a lot like a discount McLaren MP412FC. Technically brilliant, unbelievably fast for a base C8. This is the beginning mark of what they're going to do with this platform, but it is a little bit numb.
It's numb and it lacks a lot of character, I'll be honest, and it's got the same, to me it feels like the MP412C and the NSX. It's got that brake-by-wire feel, it's very synthetic. It doesn't have a lot of road noise or connectedness. It has no rawness. It is just, every edge has been refined, but there are a few advantages. The front end no longer feels as big and cumbersome. Granted, there's understeer here, which is by design.
And this car does have a track alignment that we're in right now from Xtreme. Before anyone brings that up.
Yes, so we're on better brake pads, gyro disc rotors for better thermal capacity, so it's a little bit closer in some ways to your Grand Sport Corvette, but while GM has had 15, 20 years to refine the C7 or the C6, C5, this is a first attempt, and I think it's okay. It's a great street car, but it doesn't do a whole lot for me at this point as a fun-to-drive connected machine. There's no taking away what they did here was a great achievement for the subsidized price tag that they're trying to sell it for. If you can get it for that, this is an amazing car. It's not a driver's car at this point. It's not a track car, and I'm gonna take it out on track now and go a little bit more flat out on Autobahn South and kind of walk through dynamically what I'm feeling when you're carrying a little bit more speed than what we're doing here.
All right.
So we're setting off in the C8 on Autobahn South in the Extreme Xperience C8. This is kind of just a recon lap, and the first thing you notice about this is it definitely has a soft front end on it, and you gotta kind of like get the front end to set because it's mid-engine and use it to work with you versus against you. And it has a very soft, like, compliant feel to it. It's not a car that has razor sharp reflexes, and it's tuned this way on purpose. Its first tendency is to understeer, and with the brake pads that they put on here, it's pretty competent. It feels really controlled. You can get into the pedal pretty deep, and it's not going to lock up the ABS. It still feels pretty synthetic because of the drive-by-wire. It doesn't have that really strong, like, hydraulic feel to it, which is kind of strange if you're used to driving any other car on the planet. But the transmission makes this super easy to drive. It doesn't have the revs like a GT350, but you can still, it still feels like it wants to wind out effortlessly, which is really nice. But yeah, this thing has terminal understeer, and you can't get away from that, and that's what makes this a far better street car than a track car. I'm in the C7 Grand Sport. Just got out of the C8. The first thing you're going to notice about this car is it's far more direct. The front end is far more planted, and it feels more connected. It's just much faster overall. You can get deeper into the brakes. The front end doesn't wash out as much. Like the tighter stuff especially, you can just whip this thing in and out of it. And the tail wants to move around a lot more. So you got to be a little bit more careful on the throttle, but it's not that big of a deal. This thing is just such a joy to drive. It's more honed, it's more finely, just kind of as good as the C7 can get as a driver's car. Inputs are simple. Just one simple input, it just works with you. There's a lot more confidence to push this car harder instantly. It kind of sets better. I can build up the speed easier. The brakes are more responsive. And I'm not even really going 10/10ths here. This is like 8 or 9/10ths. The main thing is in the tight stuff. That's where it makes the biggest difference. You can jam this thing in and it doesn't like wash out. You're not constantly fighting the car, and that's why it's so much more fun. So I guess the moral of the story is, if you want more of a track car at this point, the C7's cheaper, it's available, there's a manual transmission, and it's just more fun to drive on the track.
Final thoughts on the C8. While others have had the opportunity and gift to go to press events to drive it, or to get manufacturer support with information, we've had to be way more creative, which is why there's so many moving pieces here. But here's the pros and cons of it. This is a great street car. It's one of GM's best efforts ever. Interior, exterior, and engineering. It is one of the best GT cars. It is a touring car. It is super comfortable. And it is a first generation. It is a first try at a new mid-engine architecture. And that is where the pros are, because you know it has extreme overhead. What this car could be over the course of 10 years compared to where the C7 was will be leaps and bounds better.
It's way better than most companies that design new sports cars from the start, like the new NSX, for example. It's way less money, but this just goes to show you what one of the largest organizations in the world, they have access to a shitload of cash and capital to invest in the Corvette. So the best part about that is it really is a subsidized price. If you could get it for what the sticker is, between 60 to 80,000, you're gonna love this car. And that's why the owner loves it and so many people have hyped it up. But at this point, the car is far too soft. It is not a driver's car. The front end has no grip to it. The front end is too soft. And I know at this point, if I had to have a track car like we talked about, the C7 Grand Sport was far faster, way more enjoyable to drive. You don't have to fight it as much, and you had a manual transmission. There's a little bit more rough edge there. There's a little bit more connectedness that the C8 has lost in the process of refinement for the target demographic that GM knew that was going to buy it. Those buyers wanted more flash, more flair, more quality, and more softness. And that's how I would sum up the C8. Now, a big thanks to Autobahn Country Club, who we are working with to improve our videos. If you want to get a sports car, it's one of the best places to take it, to become a member there, to experience all those offerings. Xperience in Chicagoland. They are a traveling circus of exotic and sports cars. If you're in the market for a car and you like this GT500 and you want to go flat out in it, it's hard to do that on a test drive or even get your hands on it. They buy these cars so you can go out there and drive them and experience them. And for me, that is a huge bonus. So check them out. And last but not least, if you would like to potentially win a C8 Corvette, all you have to do is donate on omaze.com/savagegees. It will help us, it helps them, and it helps their non-for-profit organization which they represent, UCLA Medical Center. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next video.